petals and portfolios. The autumn rain pattered against the windows of Botanical Impressions, the soft sound nearly drowning out the classical music playing from Joe Reeves' ancient speaker system. She hummed along to Debussy, while adding delicate brushstrokes to her latest botanical illustration, a rare orchid commissioned by a local conservatory. Josephine had converted the former flower shop into a botanical art studio 3 years ago, pursuing her passion after leaving a soul-crushing corporate design job. The space retained its charm with exposed brick walls now covered with framed illustrations of flora from around the world. The transformation had been financially risky, but she'd never regretted choosing passion over practicality. The bell above the door jingled, and Jo looked up from her work table. "I'll be right with you," she called, carefully setting down her watercolor brush. The man who entered seemed oddly out of place. Tailored charcoal suit slightly dampened from the rain, leather portfolio tucked under one arm. His face held the weariness of someone ending a long day rather than beginning one. "Welcome to Botanical Impressions," Jo said, wiping paint-stained fingers on her apron. "I'm Josephine Reeves, Dominic Harrington." His voice was quiet but carried a natural authority. "I was told you create custom botanical illustrations." "That's right. For publications, private collections, or just because someone loves plants," she replied with a genuine smile. "What brings you here, Mr. Harrington?" "I'm renovating my firm's offices," he explained, glancing around at her displayed work with careful consideration. The designer suggested botanical art for the conference rooms. "Something authentic, not mass-produced prints," Jo nodded. "Well, you're in the right place for authentic. Would you like to see my portfolio?" As she guided him through her collection, Jo noticed how he studied each piece with unexpected attentiveness. Most corporate clients made quick decisions based on color schemes and size requirements, but Dominic asked questions about techniques and the plants themselves. "This one," he said, pausing at a series depicting native wildflowers. "There's something honest about them," Jo smiled. "They're often overlooked, common plants people walk past without noticing, but they have their own quiet beauty." "Exactly," he said, meeting her eyes briefly. Something in his expression shifted, a momentary softening. Later, after discussing commission details, Jo learned that Dominic Harrington wasn't simply renovating offices. He was the founder of Harrington Ventures, a firm responsible for funding some of the city's most innovative startups. "You're the Dominic Harrington?" Jo asked, suddenly self-conscious of her paint-splattered studio. He nodded, seeming uncomfortable with the recognition. "Does that change the commission?" "No," Jo replied honestly. "The plants don't care how important you are, and neither do my brushes." For the first time, Dominic smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "That's refreshing." As he prepared to leave, contract signed for a series of 12 illustrations, the rain outside intensified. Jo impulsively grabbed an umbrella from behind the counter. "Here," she offered. "You can return it next time." "Next time?" he asked, "for the preliminary sketches. Unless you'd rather communicate by email only?" Dominic took the umbrella, his fingers briefly touching hers. "No. I'll come back in person." After he left, Jo realized she'd given him her favorite umbrella, the one with hand-painted botanical designs along the edge. She smiled to herself, wondering if the serious venture capitalist would even notice such a detail. Little did she know that Dominic Harrington, who spent his days evaluating the potential of businesses and people, had already noticed everything about Josephine Reeves, and found her invaluable. Worlds apart. 3 weeks after their initial meeting, Dominic Harrington had visited Botanical Impressions 5 times, far more than necessary for the commission's progress. Today marked visit number 6, and Jo found herself unconsciously checking her appearance before he arrived. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "He's just a client." But even as the thought formed, the bell above the door announced his arrival. Dominic entered carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups and her umbrella, the one she'd lent him during their first meeting. "I thought you might need caffeine," he said by way of greeting. "The barista recommended their lavender latte, though I can't vouch for it personally." Jo accepted the offered cup with surprise. "Thank you. How did you know I was running on empty today?" "You mentioned your late night working on the conservatory project when we spoke yesterday," he replied simply, setting his briefcase down. The fact that he'd remembered such a casual detail made something flutter in Joe's chest. Their phone conversation had been brief, just her confirming she'd completed the first set of sketches for his approval. "I brought your umbrella back," he added, handing over the floral-patterned accessory. "You could have returned it weeks ago," Joe said, taking a sip of the perfectly prepared latte. Dominic's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a hint of amusement. "I kept hoping for rain." The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Joe cleared her throat and gestured to the portfolio on her work table. "I've finished the preliminary sketches for the first 6 pieces," she said, spreading them out. "I thought we could discuss any adjustments before I begin the final illustrations." As they reviewed her work, Joe became increasingly aware of how close they stood. Dominic's cologne, subtle and expensive, mingled with the familiar smells of her studio, watercolors, paper, and the potted plants she kept for reference. The contrast seemed fitting somehow. "These are exceptional," he said finally, "particularly this one." He indicated a detailed drawing of native grasses, humble plants she'd elevated through careful attention to their intricate structures. "Really? Most people are drawn to the more colorful, showy flowers." Dominic shook his head. "Those have their place, but there's something compelling about seeing ordinary things rendered with such care. You make people notice what they've been overlooking." Their eyes met, and Joe felt a charge between them that had nothing to do with the commission. "I should ask," Dominic said suddenly, "if you're free this Friday evening." Joe blinked, momentarily speechless. "For the project?" "For dinner," he clarified, his confident demeanor faltering slightly. "Unrelated to the commission, though we can certainly discuss art if you'd prefer." "I'd like that," she replied, a smile spreading across her face. "Dinner, I mean, not just art talk." "Good." Relief flickered across his features. "I'll pick you up at 7. After he left, Joe sat at her work table, attempting to focus on her work but finding her thoughts continuously drifting to Dominic. She reached for her phone, calling her best friend Prisha. "The venture capitalist asked me to dinner," she blurted when Prisha answered. "The one with the cheekbones who keeps finding excuses to visit?" Prisha laughed. "I told you he wasn't just interested in botanical illustrations." "It's probably nothing," Joe protested weakly. "We just connect somehow." And have you Googled him yet? Because I did after you mentioned him last time." "That feels invasive." "It's public information," Prisha countered. "Joe, the man is worth millions. His firm backed half the tech startups in the city. Last year he was on the cover of Business Quarterly." Joe frowned. "That doesn't matter to me." "Maybe not to you, but it matters in his world. Just be careful, okay?" Friday arrived, and Joe found herself standing in front of her apartment mirror, second-guessing her outfit choice. The emerald dress was the nicest thing she owned, purchased years ago for a gallery opening. When Dominic arrived, his appreciative gaze erased her doubts. Instead of the expected luxury restaurant, he took her to a small riverside bistro with fairy lights strung across a patio overlooking the water. "I hope this is all right," he said as they were seated. "It's one of my favorite places. Family-owned, been here for generations." "It's perfect," Joe replied, genuinely charmed. "Not what I expected, though." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" "Something with white tablecloths and waiters who judge your wine selection," she admitted. He laughed, a sound she was hearing more frequently as they spent time together. "I get enough of that at business functions. Places like this," he gestured around them. "They're harder to find." Over dinner, Joe discovered that beneath Dominic's reserved exterior was a man who spoke passionately about sustainable business practices, who had a dry sense of humor, and who listened, really listened, when she talked about her art. "Why botanical illustration?" he asked as they shared dessert. "What drew you to it?" Joe considered the question. "I've always found comfort in the natural world. Plants don't pretend to be something they're not. They just grow where they're planted and make the best of it." She paused. "That sounds silly, doesn't it?" "Not at all," Dominic replied softly. "Authenticity is rare." As he drove her home, a comfortable silence settled between them, until Dominic's phone began ringing incessantly. After the third call, he apologized and answered through the car's speaker system. "Harrington," he said tersely. "Dom, the Singapore deal is imploding," came a panicked voice. "Way's threatening to pull out unless you personally guarantee the additional funding." Joe watched Dominic's expression shift, his features hardening into the businessman she'd first met. "Tell him I'll be on a video call in 20 minutes, he replied, "and prepare the contingency package we discussed." After ending the call, he sighed. "I'm sorry, Joe, I need to handle this tonight." "I understand," she said, though a small part of her couldn't possibly understand a world where millions of dollars hung in the balance of a single phone call. At her door, he kissed her cheek softly. "I'd like to see you again." "I'd like that too," she replied honestly. As she watched him drive away, Joe wondered if Prisha was right. Their worlds couldn't be more different. Yet something about Dominic made her want to bridge that divide, even as she questioned whether it was possible. Glass ceilings, the invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock with embossed lettering that caught the light. Joe turned it over in her hands, reading it for the third time since Dominic had delivered it personally that morning. The Harrington Foundation Annual Investment Gala honoring innovators and visionaries. Black tie required. It's a big event, Dominic had explained, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Investors, entrepreneurs, some press. I'd like you to be there with me. After 6 weeks of quiet dinners, gallery visits, and long conversations that often stretched into the early morning hours, this felt like a significant step, one that would take their relationship from the private sanctuary they'd created into the scrutinizing public eye. "I don't exactly own gala-appropriate attire," Joe had replied, only half joking. Dominic had simply smiled. "Wear whatever makes you comfortable. You're my guest, not an exhibit." Now, standing in Prisha's apartment surrounded by borrowed dresses, Joe wasn't feeling comfortable at all. "The burgundy one," Prisha declared, holding up a floor-length gown with a modest neckline and elegant draping. "It complements your coloring and doesn't scream trying too hard one. Is that what I'm doing?" "Trying too hard?" Joe asked, suddenly self-conscious. Prisha's expression softened. "No, honey. You're just trying to navigate unfamiliar territory." She hung the dress on the door. "For what it's worth, I think he's serious about you. The way he looked at you when you both came to dinner last week, that wasn't casual interest." Joe smiled at the memory. Dominic had seemed completely at ease among her friends, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely enjoying their company. He'd even helped wash dishes afterward, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt without hesitation. "I really like him, Prish. More than I expected to." "I know," her friend replied. "Just remember who you are when you're in that room full of people who measure worth in dollar signs." The night of the gala, Dominic arrived in a sleek black car, stepping out in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that made Joe momentarily forget how to breathe. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes taking in her burgundy gown and the simple gold pendant at her throat, a family heirloom from her grandmother. "So do you," she replied, making him laugh. "Well, handsome. Devastatingly so." The venue was a historic downtown hotel, its grand ballroom transformed with tasteful decorations and subtle lighting that highlighted the ornate ceiling. As they entered, Joe became acutely aware of curious glances and whispered conversations. "Dominic!" A tall woman with immaculate silver hair approached them, air-kissing Dominic's cheek before turning evaluating eyes toward Joe. "You've been keeping secrets. Who is your lovely companion?" "Eleanor Winthrop, meet Josephine Reeves," Dominic said formally. "Joe is a botanical artist whose work we've commissioned for the new offices." "How interesting," Eleanor replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "And do you only paint flowers, dear?" "I specialize in botanical illustration," Joe clarified. "It's scientific documentation as much as art, preserving plant species through detailed visual records." Eleanor's eyebrows lifted slightly. "How is educational? I must circulate, darling. Lovely meeting you." As the evening progressed, variations of this exchange repeated. People approached with genuine interest in Dominic, but only performative curiosity about Joe. Some were kind, others barely concealed their assessment that she was out of place. During dinner, Joe found herself seated between Dominic and a tech entrepreneur, who spoke almost exclusively about his yacht. Across the table, a woman in diamonds examined Joe through narrowed eyes. "So, Josephine," the woman said during a lull in conversation, "how exactly did you and Dominic meet? It must be quite the story." The table quieted, attention shifting to Joe. She felt Dominic's hand cover hers beneath the tablecloth, a silent gesture of support. He came to my studio looking for art, Joe answered honestly. We connected over native plant species that are often overlooked. The woman exchanged glances with her companion. How unique. Josephine's work is extraordinary, Dominic interjected. Her illustrations will be featured in the Botanical Society's upcoming publication on endangered flora. While his defense was touching, Joe couldn't help feeling like an exotic specimen being justified to skeptical observers. After dinner came speeches and the presentation of grants to selected startups. Joe watched with genuine pride as Dominic took the stage, speaking passionately about innovation and responsibility. In this element, he was commanding and visionary, outlining the foundation's commitment to businesses addressing climate change and social inequality. He's quite impressive, murmured a voice beside her. Joe turned to find an older gentleman with kind eyes. I'm Thomas Mercer. I've known Dominic since he was a determined young man with more ideas than capital. Joe Reeves, she replied, shaking his offered hand. I know, Thomas smiled. He's mentioned you, several times actually. Has he? Joe couldn't hide her surprise. Indeed, said you were teaching him to see things differently. The older man's eyes crinkled. That's valuable, especially in our world where perspective can narrow without us realizing it. As the formal portion of the evening concluded and the orchestra began playing, Dominic found her again, offering his hand. Dance with me? On the dance floor, held securely in his arms, Joe finally relaxed. Your speech was wonderful. Thank you, he replied, guiding her effortlessly between other couples. How are you holding up? It's been educational, Joe answered diplomatically. Dominic's mouth quirked. That bad? Let's just say I've received more condescending pats on the arm tonight than in my entire previous existence. His expression darkened. It doesn't matter, Joe interrupted. This is your world, Dominic. I'm just visiting. That's not how I see it, he said quietly. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by a striking woman in a tailored black gown. Dominic, darling, you've been hiding all evening. She placed a manicured hand on his arm, then turned to Joe with a practiced smile. Victoria Blackwood. Dominic and I go way back. Josephine Reeves, Joe replied, noticing how Victoria's hand lingered on Dominic's sleeve. Victoria is the head of our legal team, Dominic explained, subtly shifting away from her touch. Among other things, Victoria added with a meaningful look that made Joe's stomach tighten. The board has been asking when you're going to settle down, Dominic. They're concerned about leadership stability. The board should concern themselves with our portfolio performance, not my personal life, he replied coolly. Victoria laughed, always so serious. I'm getting a drink, join me? After she sauntered away, Joe released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She's beautiful. She's calculating, Dominic countered. Everything is strategic with Victoria, including her interest in you. His eyes met hers. We briefly dated years ago. It wasn't right for numerous reasons. Joe nodded, trying to ignore the voice in her head cataloging all the ways Victoria Blackwood fit seamlessly into Dominic's world. Ways that Joe never would. As the evening continued, Joe excused herself to find the restroom. Taking a wrong turn in the labyrinthine hallways, she accidentally stumbled upon a small group that included Eleanor Winthrop and Victoria. Clearly a phase, Victoria was saying. Dominic occasionally slums it when he's bored with our circle. The artist does seem sweet, Eleanor replied, but honestly, what could they possibly have in common? It's one thing to buy her little paintings, but to bring her here. Joe backed away silently, heart pounding. The words stung not because they were surprising, but because they articulated the exact doubts she'd been harboring herself. When she returned, Dominic immediately sensed something had changed. What's wrong? Nothing, Joe lied, forcing a smile. Just a headache coming on. But as she stood beside him for the remainder of the evening, the glass walls between their worlds had never felt more visible or more impenetrable. Breaking point. The week following the gala passed in a blur of conflicting emotions for Joe. Outwardly, she maintained her usual routine, working on commissions, teaching her weekly botanical illustration workshop at the community center, having coffee with Prisha. But internally, she wrestled with the voices from the gala that seemed to echo her own deepest insecurities. Dominic had called daily, sensing her withdrawal but respecting her space when she claimed to be busy with deadlines. In truth, Jo was attempting to regain her equilibrium, to remember who she was before Dominic Harrington entered her life and complicated everything. On Friday evening, Jo found herself alone in her studio, adding final touches to one of Dominic's commissioned pieces. Ironically, an illustration of desert plants that thrived in harsh environments. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to find Dominic standing there, his tall frame silhouetted against the twilight outside. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding me," he said quietly, setting a small package on her counter. Jo set down her brush. "I've just been busy." For someone who values authenticity, that's not a very honest answer. The gentle challenge in his voice broke something loose inside her. "What are we doing, Dominic?" "Really?" He stepped closer. "I thought we were building something meaningful. At least that's what I've been doing." "And what happens when the novelty wears off?" Jo asked, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. "When you realize that I'll never fit into board meetings and investment galas?" Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You heard something at the event." "I heard the truth," Jo replied. "That I'm your slumming phase. That we have nothing in common." Dominic's expression hardened. "Who said that?" "It doesn't matter who. What matters is they're not wrong." Jo gestured around her modest studio. "This is my world. Plants and paper and paint. I saved for 3 years to afford the security deposit on this place. Meanwhile, you make investment decisions over lunch that are worth more than I'll earn in my lifetime. You think that's what matters to me? Money?" "No," Jo admitted. "But it matters to everyone around you. Your board, your investors, your colleagues. Eventually, you'll need to care what they think." Dominic ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You're making assumptions about what I need." "Am I?" Victoria made it clear the board wants you to settle down appropriately. "Someone like her would make sense for you. Victoria is the last person I would ever—" He stopped, taking a deep breath. "This isn't about Victoria or the board. This is about you and me and why you've been pulling away since the gala." Jo turned back to her illustration, needing something to focus on besides Dominic's intense gaze. "I just needed to think, to be realistic about where this is going." "And what conclusion did you reach?" His voice was carefully controlled. "That maybe we're kidding ourselves," Jo said softly. "That relationships don't survive this kind of imbalance. Eventually, you'll resent explaining me to your associates, and I'll resent feeling like I'm not enough." Dominic was silent for a long moment. "Is that what you think of me? That I'd be ashamed of you?" The hurt in his voice made Jo look up. "No, not intentionally. But practically speaking, I'm falling in love with you," Dominic interrupted, his words hanging in the air between them. "Is that practical enough?" Jo's breath caught. "Dominic, I brought something for you," he said, nodding toward the package on the counter. "Open it, please." With trembling fingers, Jo unwrapped the small box to find an antique botanical book, a rare first edition she had once mentioned admiring in a museum exhibition. "How did you even find this?" she whispered, carefully turning its delicate pages. "It took some searching," he admitted, "but that's what I do for things I value." The gesture touched her deeply, but it also reinforced the gulf between them. Such a gift would have represented months of saving for her. For him, it was simply a thoughtful purchase. "It's beautiful," she said honestly, "but it doesn't change anything." Something shifted in Dominic's expression, a new determination. "Come with me tomorrow night." "Where?" "The Botanical Society is hosting their annual fundraiser. Your work is being featured, and I've arranged for us to attend." Jo stiffened. "You did what?" "I made a donation in your name," Dominic explained. "They were planning to include one of your illustrations in the auction anyway. I simply suggested they might want to invite the artist. Without asking me." Jo felt a flare of indignation. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Dominic. You can't just rearrange things because you have money and influence." "That's not what I was doing," he insisted. "I wanted to support your work, to show you that I'm proud of who you are. By buying my way into an event?" Dominic stepped back as if she'd struck him. "Is that really how you see it?" Jo closed the book carefully, setting it on her work table. "I need to know that you see me. Really see me. Not just as someone you can elevate or fix." "I have never thought you needed fixing," Dominic replied, his voice low and intense. "From the moment I walked in here, you were the most authentic person I'd ever met. Do you know how rare that is in my world? Everyone wants something from me, position, connections, funding. But you just treated me like a person. Because that's what you are to me, Joe said simply. Not a portfolio or a stepping stone or a status symbol. Then why can't you believe I see you the same way? The question hung between them unanswered. Finally, Joe sighed. I'll go tomorrow. But not because you arranged it, because my work deserves to be there. Dominic nodded. Fair enough. The following evening unfolded nothing like Joe had anticipated. The Botanical Society fundraiser was held in the conservatory gardens, a magical space illuminated by string lights woven among the exotic plants. Unlike the stifling formality of the investment gala, this event had a relaxed elegance that immediately put Joe at ease. More surprisingly, people recognized her work before they recognized Dominic. Respected botanists and fellow artists approached her with genuine questions and admiration. For the first time since they'd begun dating, Joe felt completely in her element while Dominic stood supportively by her side. Your pieces are exquisite, commented the Society's elderly president, examining Joe's detailed rendering of endangered orchids. We've been hoping to feature your work for some time. Thank you, Joe replied, genuinely touched. It means a great deal to have it recognized here. The recognition is well-deserved, the woman assured her before turning to Dominic. Mr. Harrington, your foundation's contribution toward the conservation program is most appreciated. It's a worthy cause, Dominic replied, especially with artists like Josephine documenting the species we're working to protect. Throughout the evening, Joe noticed how Dominic intentionally redirected conversations back to her work, stepping aside to let her expertise shine. It was a side of him she'd glimpsed in private, but never seen him display so publicly. As they moved toward the auction area, they encountered Victoria Blackwood, unexpectedly present at the botanical event. Dominic, she greeted him with surprise. I didn't realize you'd be here tonight. Victoria, he acknowledged coolly. I'm here supporting Josephine. Her work is featured in the auction. Victoria's gaze flickered to Joe, reassessing. How nice. I'm here representing clients with conservation interests. Then you should definitely bid on Joe's piece, Dominic suggested. It would be a valuable addition to any collection. Before Victoria could respond, the announcement came that the auction was beginning. As they took their seats, Joe noticed several prominent collectors examining her illustration with interest. When her piece came up for bidding, the starting price was already higher than any amount she'd previously received for her work. Then the bidding began in earnest, quickly exceeding her expectations. In the end, her illustration sold for an amount that left her momentarily breathless, enough to cover her studio's rent for nearly 6 months. The winning bidder, a Conservation Foundation director, sought her out afterward to commission an entire series. Congratulations, Dominic said when they finally had a moment alone in the conservatory's tropical section, though I'm not surprised. Your talent deserves recognition. Joe studied his face in the gentle lighting. You didn't bid? No, he confirmed. I wanted you to see that others value your work on its own merit. This wasn't about my money or connections. This was all you, Joe. The realization washed over her. He had deliberately brought her to a place where she was the accomplished one, where her expertise and talent were what mattered. Yet even in this moment of professional triumph, the fundamental question remained unanswered. As they walked through the fragrant garden paths, Joe finally gave voice to what had been troubling her since the gala. Dominic, she said, stopping beside a reflecting pool, I need to be honest with you and with myself. I'm proud of my work and my life, but I don't know if I can be part of your world without losing myself in the process. Dominic's face grew serious. What are you saying? I'm saying, Joe took a deep breath. I don't think I deserve someone whose life is so different from mine. Someone who could have anyone. We come from different worlds, and eventually, that matters. Around them, other guests moved through the gardens in small groups, their murmured conversations creating a gentle background hum. But in this moment, it felt as though she and Dominic were entirely alone, standing at a crossroads that would determine everything that followed. You don't deserve me, Dominic repeated, his voice strangely quiet. Is that what you truly believe? Joe nodded, tears threatening. Our worlds don't match, Dominic. Tonight was wonderful, but it doesn't change the reality. Something shifted in his expression then, a decision being made. He looked around at the gathering, then took her hand firmly in his. "Come with me," he said, leading her toward the center of the conservatory where most of the guests had gathered. "What are you doing?" Joe whispered, alarmed. Dominic didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand, requesting attention from the crowd. Gradually, conversations ceased as curious faces turned toward them. "Dominic, don't," Joe pleaded quietly, mortified by the public attention. But he was already speaking, his voice clear and resolute in the hushed space. "I apologize for the interruption, but I need to address something important. Trueworth." "I apologize for the interruption," Dominic continued, his voice resonating through the conservatory. "But I need to address something important that I believe many of you might relate to." Joe felt heat rising to her cheeks as dozens of curious eyes turned toward them. She tried to pull her hand away, but Dominic held it firmly, his thumb brushing reassuringly across her knuckles. "Most of you know me as Dominic Harrington, the venture capitalist," he said. "You know my portfolio, my foundation's work, perhaps my reputation in business circles. But very few of you know the actual person behind those things." He paused, scanning the attentive faces. "For most of my adult life, I've been defined by what I own, what I fund, what doors I can open. People see the wealth, the influence, the carefully constructed image, rarely the human being." Joe stopped trying to escape and instead watched Dominic with growing astonishment. This public vulnerability was entirely unexpected. 6 months ago, I walked into a small botanical art studio looking for artwork for my offices, he continued. What I found instead was something I didn't even realize I was missing: authenticity. I met someone who didn't care about my net worth or my business connections. Someone who simply saw me as a person who didn't know the difference between a dahlia and a daisy. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the crowd. Joe's heart pounded as she recognized where this was heading. That someone, Dominic said, turning to face her directly, was Josephine Reeves, whose extraordinary talent you've witnessed tonight. Joe has just told me that she doesn't deserve someone like me, that our worlds are too different. Murmurs spread through the audience. Joe's face burned with embarrassment. But something in Dominic's expression kept her rooted in place. What Joe doesn't understand, what I've failed to make clear until now, is that she has it entirely backward. His voice softened, though it still carried to the entire gathering. I'm the one who doesn't deserve her. The conservatory fell completely silent. Even the gentle trickle of the decorative fountain seemed to fade away as Dominic continued. In my world, people measure worth by financial statements and influence. They network instead of connecting, calculate instead of feeling. But Joe measures worth differently. By authenticity, by passion, by the courage to pursue what matters regardless of its monetary value. He gestured toward her illustration that had sold at auction. Her work exists because she sees beauty in things most people overlook. She notices details others miss. She values truth over appearance. Dominic turned back to face the crowd, his shoulders straight with conviction. I've spent 2 decades building a financial empire, but Joe has built something far more valuable, a life of genuine purpose and integrity. And in the process, she's taught me to see my own life differently. Joe's eyes filled with tears as the weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just about defending her, it was Dominic revealing himself in a way she suspected he rarely did. So yes, we come from different worlds, he acknowledged. And thank goodness for that, because her world has made mine immeasurably richer. He turned back to Joe, taking both her hands in his. You don't deserve me? Joe, you're the standard to which I aspire. Your integrity, your authenticity, these are worth more than any portfolio I could assemble. A hushed stillness had fallen over the gathering. Joe was acutely aware of the public nature of this moment, but for once, she didn't feel judged by the onlookers. Instead, there was a collective recognition of something genuine unfolding before them. I don't care what anyone in any boardroom or at any gala thinks, Dominic continued, his voice now intended for her alone, though the silent crowd could still hear every word. I care what you think. And I hope you think that what we've found together is worth preserving, despite our differences, perhaps even because of them. Joe found her voice at last. You didn't need to do this, she whispered. Yes, I did, he replied. Because you needed to hear it, and maybe I needed to say it aloud. He glanced around at the attentive faces before focusing on her again. I'm tired of worlds that don't intersect. I'd rather build a new one with you. From the back of the crowd, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, the sound swelling through the conservatory until it surrounded them like a wave. Through tear-blurred vision, Joe noticed Victoria Blackwood watching with a complex expression, part surprise, part reluctant respect. Nearby, the elderly Botanical Society president was smiling broadly, clearly touched by the unexpected declaration. "I don't know what to say," Joe admitted when the applause finally subsided and people respectfully gave them space, returning to their conversations while casting interested glances in their direction. "You don't have to say anything right now," Dominic told her, guiding her toward a more private corner of the conservatory, a small alcove surrounded by flowering vines. "Just know that I meant every word." Joe studied his face, the genuine emotion in eyes that could calculate million-dollar deals without blinking, the vulnerability in the set of his mouth. "I've been so afraid," she confessed, "not just of not fitting into your world, but of losing myself in it, of becoming an accessory rather than a partner." "I would never want that," Dominic said firmly. "What drew me to you was precisely your distinct identity, your unwavering sense of self. Anything that diminished that would diminish what I cherish most about you." Joe took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet scent of the surrounding flowers. "You really don't care what your board thinks? Or your investors?" "I care about running a successful business," Dominic replied honestly. "But I've learned, largely through knowing you, that success looks different than I once thought. It's not just accumulation, it's about creating value that matters." He touched her cheek gently. "The people who truly matter in my life will recognize your worth just as I do. The rest aren't worth worrying about." Joe thought of her own small circle, Prisha and her other friends who had welcomed Dominic without reservation, seeing his character rather than his wealth. Perhaps both of their worlds had more room for expansion than she'd believed. "I've been measuring our relationship against impossible standards," she realized aloud, "expecting problems instead of solutions, focusing on differences instead of connections." "We are different," Dominic acknowledged. "That's not going to change. But difference doesn't have to mean distance." As they stood together in the quiet alcove, surrounded by carefully tended botanical treasures, Joe felt something settle within her, a recognition that perhaps worth wasn't about deserving at all, but about choosing, about seeing clearly and valuing honestly. "So where do we go from here?" she asked. Dominic smiled. "I think we keep building that intersection. My world becomes a bit more authentic. Yours gains some new possibilities. We both stretch in ways we might not have otherwise. And the people who think we don't make sense together? They're entitled to their opinion," he said with a shrug. "But they don't get a vote." Joe laughed suddenly, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "That was quite a speech you gave. I didn't know you had such a flair for public declarations." "Neither did I," Dominic admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm usually much more reserved. You bring out unexpected sides of me." "Likewise," Joe replied, thinking of how meeting him had pushed her to see her work and herself from new perspectives. "Though I'm not planning any grand speeches in front of your board of directors." Thank goodness. They'd probably all resigned from shock. They shared a moment of laughter, the tension of the past weeks finally dissipating. Around them, the conservatory continued to hum with conversation and music. But in their small corner, a different kind of harmony had been established. Later that evening, as they strolled along the illuminated garden paths, Joe spotted Thomas Mercer, the kind older gentleman from the investment gala, deep in conversation with the Botanical Society president. "Dominic," Thomas called, waving them over. "Your young lady's work is causing quite a stir. Helena here tells me 3 major conservation organizations are interested in commissioning her for their publications." "That's wonderful news," Dominic replied, his pride evident. "Indeed," Helena agreed. "We've been watching Ms. Reeves's work develop over the past few years. Her dedication to botanical accuracy combined with her artistic sensibility is precisely what's needed to draw attention to endangered species. The foundation would be interested in funding a broader initiative along those lines," Thomas suggested. "Documentation and preservation through art, connecting the financial world with conservation efforts." Joe found herself automatically looking to Dominic, expecting him to take the lead in this discussion that bridged their separate spheres. Instead, he stepped back slightly. "That sounds fascinating," he said. Joe would be the one to discuss the artistic possibilities. "I'm just here as moral support tonight." The simple statement, positioning her as the expert and himself as the supporter, spoke volumes. It was a small gesture but a significant one, demonstrating that their relationship didn't need to subsume either of their identities. As Joe engaged in the conversation, outlining possibilities for documenting rare plants across different ecosystems, she noticed Victoria approaching their small group. "I hear congratulations are in order," Victoria said smoothly. "Both on your auction success and other developments." Joe tensed, expecting barbed undertones, but Victoria's expression held something closer to genuine curiosity. "Thank you," Joe replied simply. Victoria glanced between her and Dominic with new assessment in her eyes. "Your piece was impressive. I should have bid more aggressively. There will be other opportunities," Joe offered. "I'm planning a series on urban wildflowers next month." "Urban wildflowers?" Victoria raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "The plants that grow through sidewalk cracks and abandoned lots? How unconventional." "Exactly," Dominic interjected. "Species that thrive despite challenging environments, finding beauty in unexpected places." The metaphor wasn't lost on any of them. Victoria's mouth curved in a small, reluctant smile. "I'll look forward to seeing it," she said, with what appeared to be genuine interest. As the evening drew to a close, Joe and Dominic stood beside the koi pond at the conservatory's entrance. Colored lights beneath the water's surface illuminated the graceful movements of the fish below. "Thank you," Joe said quietly. "Not just for tonight, but for seeing me, really seeing me from the beginning." Dominic took her hand. "That's the easy part. You're impossible not to see once someone is actually looking." "I think I've been looking at our relationship all wrong," Joe admitted, focusing on what might go wrong instead of what's already right. "We both come with our own insecurities," Dominic replied. "Mine just wear more expensive suits." Joe laughed, leaning against his shoulder. "So we're really doing this? Navigating two different worlds?" "I think we're creating a third," Dominic suggested. "Something neither of us could have built alone." As they left the conservatory together, Joe reflected that perhaps worth wasn't something to be measured by external standards at all, not by bank accounts or social standing or even professional accomplishments. Perhaps true worth resided in the courage to be authentic, in the capacity to grow, and in the willingness to see beyond surfaces to the essence beneath. 6 months later, the expanded offices of Harrington Ventures opened with an entire wing dedicated to environmental initiatives. Central to the space was a series of Joe's illustrations, not just decorative art, but working documents guiding conservation efforts funded by Dominic's foundation. The once separate circles of their lives had begun to overlap in organic, unexpected ways. Joe taught botanical illustration workshops for the children of Dominic's employees. Dominic occasionally minded her studio on weekends, surprising himself by enjoying the peaceful environment and conversations with her regular customers. At the opening reception, Dominic found Joe standing alone before her largest piece, a meticulously rendered landscape showing the subtle interactions between dozens of species in a delicate ecosystem. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, noting her pensive expression. Joe shook her head, "Just reflecting on how much has changed. A year ago, I never would have imagined being here." "Regrets?" "Not one," she replied honestly, "though I'm still getting used to Victoria actually liking me." Dominic laughed. "She respects authenticity, even if she's forgotten how to practice it herself." Joe turned to face him fully. "You know, you were right that night at the conservatory, about building something new together, rather than trying to fit into each other's existing worlds." "It's working out better than I projected," Dominic admitted. "And I'm very good at projections." "Is that the businessman talking?" "No," he replied, taking her hand. "That's just the man who finally learned what's truly valuable." Around them, the reception continued. Conservation experts mingling with investors, artists conversing with entrepreneurs, all part of the intersection they had begun to create. Not a single world belonging to either of them, but something richer that belonged to both. And in that moment, standing amid the tangible results of their shared vision, Joe finally understood what Dominic had been trying to tell her all along. True worth wasn't about deserving or not deserving. It was about recognizing value beyond conventional measures, and having the courage to nurture it, regardless of what others might see.